Good afternoon. Here's our second panel, and we're going to jump right into it to follow on from the great insights from the first panel. My name is Kailesh Karavadra, and I work at EY, and I'm the West Coast Growth Markets Lead, a managing partner. And so every day I get to see lots of entrepreneurs and lots of people who are investing all over the world across the entire West Coast. So I'll share some insights from that. But what we're here to listen to are four wonderful panelists here who have a lot of insights about doing business in India and investments. So maybe to kick things off, before we allow each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and by the way, we have here from Lightspeed, Nakul, Mandan, and Dinesh, Katiyar from Accel. Helion, we have Ashish, Gupta, and then Emergent, Ankur, Jain. So welcome to all of you guys. What we'll do is we'll allow each of them just a couple of minutes to introduce themselves in more detail for the ambassador here, and so what they're doing, and specifically what they're doing in India. And then I have some questions for them, and we'll see if we can get some good insights, and then we'll maybe open it up if you have some questions in the time frame. Sound good? All right. So maybe Dinesh, we'll start with you.
Sure. First, thanks for the opportunity. I'm at Accel. We started venture investing about 35 years ago here in the US, and then about I think 20 odd years ago we expanded into Europe. So we have a team based out of London, and 10 years ago we actually set up a team in India based out of Bangalore. So I think in general that was the third geography we chose to be in, which is something very encouraging for us as folks of Indian origin. 10 years ago when we started, very early on we were lucky to invest in companies like Flipkart, which has obviously become a very big sort of symbol of what can be done. Of course, we were hoping that it would start a Black Friday style mania of companies rushing to go into India to strike deals. But hopefully by next Thanksgiving we'll have that. Obviously, we'll talk more about the India story, but about 7 years ago, we also started actively investing in companies originating from India, but going after a global market. We think that that's an incredibly promising trend. Again, we were fortunate to invest in companies like Freshdesk and now Freshworks, which is, again, one of the iconic companies on that landscape. As part of that, actually, I was added to the team, and I'm based here. So I am part of Accel's India investment team, but based here in Silicon Valley. So we were very committed to really trying to help entrepreneurs who want to build these global companies, and how can we structure ourselves to be helpful. But yeah.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. My name is Nakul. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners here in the Bay Area office. I grew up in India, studied there, and then was doing growth investing in India for 3 years, and then 9 years ago moved to the Bay Area. Primarily focus here on B2B investing. And Lightspeed is at this point a global platform. We started about 20 years ago. 10 years ago, we started an India office. Right around that time, we also started a China office, and we have an Israel office as well. So at this point, a pretty global platform. And it's a pretty tightly integrated team. So often when our India partners are looking at some opportunities in consumer or enterprise, the expertise that we've built here is seamlessly transferred there. We are constantly in touch with a lot of the Indian portfolio companies. Some of the companies that we've been involved with in India include Oyo Rooms, ShareChat, Byju's, and several others. And then accordingly here, some of the companies we've been involved with include Snapchat, Nest, The Honest Company, App Dynamics, Nutanix. And what we've seen over the last decade or so is that India definitely got off to a slow start, but in terms of the scale of companies that are coming up now, they're matching any geography. And some of the learnings here can be leveraged there, but a lot of those companies are actually creating brand new business models and really are truly building in India from ground up.
I'm Ankur Jain. I'm founder of a firm called Emergent Ventures. We're a young firm started about 2 years ago, investing in US and India. In US, we do a lot around enterprise software, B2B software, About a third of the portfolio is companies from India, but targeting the US market. In India, we're investing in areas around, especially around transportation technologies like smart logistics, and something around vehicle electrification ecosystems. For us, our core thesis is around investing in entrepreneurs who we see on a very fast trajectory of personal growth, and we see that as a leading indicator for the companies they build. We're often the first investment in the seed, pre-A, the first money in the companies.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm Ashish. I'm with a firm called Helion Ventures, and we are based primarily in India. And much like Dinesh, I am the outpost here in the US for the firm that is based in India. I spent 8 years in India from 2006 to 2014, and then relocated back here in 2014, given that a number of our companies also started going after the US market. We've got a mix of consumer companies like Make My Trip or Ola Cabs or Big Basket, which does online shopping. And then there are a number of enterprise-focused companies that find that the enterprise market in India is really not worth chasing. And so they invariably end up going after the US market. And there are a whole host of them, and I'm here to help misguide some of them, and maybe some of them will save themselves. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. So maybe to get started, and I'm sure the ambassador and Dr. Mukesh here know this, but I asked this question of my team in India, and I said, if I had a few spare dollars, why would I want to invest in India? And they sent me a lot of data back, so I thought you might find this interesting. So let me share just a couple of things for you. First thing is, apparently this year will be on track to be the largest in history for investments, probably around $29 billion that have gone into India. There are 40,000 startups in India today, 40,000, which is huge. And deal sizes are going to be higher this year in terms of anything over $100 million. Last year, there were 55. So this isn't small investments. These are pretty significant. And then when you look at what is around the corner for India and why we should be excited about the next 3, 4, 5 years or so, 1 in 4 graduates in the world will be coming from India. It'll be the youngest country, age 29, in a few years. In terms of being the largest GDP, we already know that, of the countries. 600 million professionals. 600 million professionals in India, 460 million internet users, 430 million mobile internet users, and this one really was outstanding. 750 universities, 40,000 colleges, which means every year India has 10 million new participants in the workforce, which is phenomenal when you look at that. And it's also the top destination for foreign direct investment when you think about what's going on. So with that, I do have a personal story in that my son actually works for a startup company, and the company is based here in San Jose, so they started here, but their sole market is India. So he is actually in New Delhi right now. They're launching and doing various things. So I personally need India to be successful so he can pay me back for his education. All right, let me ask some questions. And this is for Nakul and Ankur. What is it, because you're based here, unlike Ashish and Dinesh here, but just in terms of your organization, what is the view of making investments in Silicon Valley? Like, what's the word on the street from here? Are people excited? Because there's lots of opportunities in Silicon Valley, right? So what are your thoughts?
So I think most investors who are here, their view is, of course, India is exciting, there's a lot happening, but we have a lot of local opportunities, and there are enough investors in India who can handle the complications and challenges there and let them invest in India. And there are a few large growth stage investors who may look at opportunities which are once they go to a certain size, but most others are exciting, but not for us. So despite the huge number of investors in the Valley, there are actually only a few who actually are willing from here to take a deeper look into what's happening in India and sort of double clicking into that. In our case, we do that specifically for companies coming out of India for the US market, helping them from the early stage and helping them get established here and target the US market. But despite the huge number of Indian community, that traditionally is not actually not too many early stage investors who are investing from here into India.
Yeah, I have a similar view. I think you have to vote. If at the early stages, you have to vote with your feet and dollars. So you have to have a local team. And so the local team is dedicated to India investing. We have a team here that's dedicated to Silicon Valley or US investing. And the trick for a fund like us is more how do you have seamless integration and transfer of knowledge and wisdom to the extent there's wisdom in venture capital. But that's the challenge, I think. So when we first opened an office, and I'm sure it's similar for Accel, maybe that at that time India wasn't as hot a market, and it definitely went through its Gartner hype cycle kind of a curve, and there was a post-hype period of 2010, 11. But in venture and in most businesses like this, you have to take like a multiple decades call that we believe this geography will work and we are going to grind through it. And that's what worked for us. And that during that time, we had the team locally present. They were constantly looking, but we were probably slow to deploy money during that time. And now it's getting deployed much faster. And it's a function of how many opportunities you see. The other thing I'll say is local autonomy of decision making is important. I think teams that went to India, but the decision was being made in Silicon Valley, inevitably left India eventually because they never could understand the local nuances.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Let me start with you, Ashish, and I'd like all of your views on this one. But as I mentioned, 29 billion investment, 40,000 startups, 10 million new jobs, and such a young workforce. So a lot of innovation going on. What's changed to make that happen, and what kind of opportunities do you see in India today? As you look at India and you say, wow, this is going to be exciting, what do you see?
So I started investing in India in about 1999. And the first several investments were in the classical BPO, KPO sense, where it was viewed as a labor arbitrage play. And then there was an echo of the internet boom, and there was an echo of the internet bust, which all happened relatively quickly. But I think that ended up sparking, and Kamal is smiling there. He's, I guess, more experienced in doing this than the rest of us rolled up. So that set of companies that started out there, I think, have really, really left a mark, whether it is Naukri or Make My Trip and so on and so forth. So one thing that has changed meaningfully in line with, I think you were talking about several tens of millions of internet users getting added, that trend just continues. So that is one thing that has changed. I think another thing that has very seriously changed, when I was growing up, I was looking for a job. The kids who are graduating right now, they take jobs for granted. So just the mindset for what somebody wants to achieve is very different. It is not about controlling downside, it is about optimizing upside. So the quality of entrepreneurs and the maturity of entrepreneurs and the hunger of entrepreneurs is just a steadily increasing curve. Is it at the same level as a lot of entrepreneurs in the valley in several spaces? The answer is no. But is it getting constantly better? The answer is absolutely yes. So in the last 12 years that Helion has existed, there is a sea change in the quality of entrepreneurs. So I would put that as another thing that has changed.
Wonderful. Ankur?
I would just add to that. When we always look at any company, we look at the top down and the bottoms up. The top down view, like you said, there are a lot of great metrics, but in India, but that was always the case even 20 years ago. Investors came in 90s and middle class is here, it'll go here, internet is here, it'll go here. But for almost 10, 15 years, they did not see good returns. And investors investing in Africa, Latin America, they still have, from the top down, they look great metrics, why they should invest. But I think what has changed, in addition to what Ashish was saying, is from bottom-up perspective, more entrepreneurs are thinking on lines the way the venture capital model works, and in ways that they can work better with investors. The first generation, I would say 10 years ago, were just not, it was not meshing with how the investors would look at these companies. Also the talent availability in terms of technology, in terms of product management, sales, was not there to sort of support these companies. Often maybe have, the objectives may be great, but they were not, in terms of execution, were not there to support it. And that has changed. So I think it's, I wouldn't say anything changed suddenly, but I think bit by bit over the last 10, 15 years, it's been changing. And now I think, now that you see outcomes, then now people certainly say, you know what, things have changed. People realize that.
And Nakul and Dinesh, also add what kind of opportunities do you see besides just looking at why is India so hot today? Because when I mentioned the number, there's 430 million mobile internet users. 430. That's bigger than the population of the entire North America here. So they're all active. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think in the first wave, we did see a lot of businesses and a lot of entrepreneurs that were really trying to replicate models that existed elsewhere. I think one of the most encouraging things these days is, one, we're seeing a lot more entrepreneurs where they're starting companies out of frustrations, right? And to me, that's an awesome sign, right? These are people who are encountering some pain firsthand, and are also realizing that entrepreneurship is a option there, right? So I think that just sort of bodes really well, and it also has just enriched the kinds of businesses that we now see, right? These are not X of Y, or the second slide is not about how there are 4 other companies in the world that do what they do. I think the other interesting aspect is when you look at companies here, invariably they've had to improve upon the previous wave of digitization, right? So we've had mainframes, we've had PCs, we've had the cloud, we have mobile, and each wave really had to unleash benefits over the previous wave. The opportunity in India, in that sense, is quite exciting, because we're getting to tackle the entire opportunity in sort of one go. So in that sense, when you create a difference in the way business is is done today, the opportunity is actually much larger than what it was before. So I think again those are interesting differences that we now see playing out.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is I see a lot more companies come up that are truly addressing India-focused problems. So earlier it was like, let's build Uber for India or something else like that. And now there are companies like ShareChat, for instance, which is thinking about, social networks or all these apps only work for English and English-based keyboard systems and typing, so they're building localized networks. That's a problem that is so India-driven, because India has that many languages. No other country in the world has that many local languages. Udan is building a network and supply chain for wholesalers in India. Again, India's shopping or India's retail is much more fragmented than the US. In some ways, China has Alibaba. US doesn't have an Alibaba for the US, but India is building that. So I think there are more companies that are now focused on what is the actual problem here and building from first principles rather than what worked elsewhere. And so I think that's pretty interesting.
Fascinating. Recently I went on a trip to India for work, and I went all the way from Mumbai to Delhi, Gurgaon, Chennai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And that Bangalore traffic is terrible, by the way, you were mentioning. But it was fascinating for me. One of the questions that I found people asking was they're looking for investors from Silicon Valley. And it's fascinating for me to hear that. What is it that they're enamored by, that they're looking for from Silicon Valley? What role can they play? Ashish, do we want to start with you? And
I'll start with the...
Oh.
More legitimate Silicon Valley investment. That's true.
So I think you have to marry the local knowledge with ability or the experience of seeing companies scale non-linearly and to a massive level. And I think that's the other thing that has changed in the Indian ecosystem, that with companies like Flipkart and even the big offices of Google and all of those have yielded enough number of execs who've seen massive scale. And so when somebody has to manage 1,000 people workforce, there are actually managers to choose from when you're hiring a VP, versus 10 years ago, that level of talent was just not present. That's the benefit, actually. That is Silicon Valley's moat, that if you want to hire a VP of sales here, you have 200 candidates to choose from. If you want to hire a VP of sales, even in a different city in the US, you don't have, and that is why Silicon Valley retains its moat over the rest of the US, for instance. And so I think that is probably the one thing I could imagine that a Silicon Valley investor can still bring to the Indian startup, that people here have seen massive scale over multiple companies. They don't get overjoyed with one company suddenly kind of rocketing, because we've also seen, a lot of us here have also seen that going to $1 billion happens, but coming down from $1 billion to literally zero also happens. And so you're not at the end of the journey when you're at $1 billion market cap. And I think there's some more maturity still in Silicon Valley compared to India on those kinds of fronts.
When I hear that from companies, a few reasons. One is, some I would say justified, some not so justified. One I would say justified reasons, if they're targeting global markets, obviously, they're looking for investors who can help them. That's, I would say, justified reason. Although the venture industry in India, like we mentioned, is about 10 years old. So they're not, number of investors who are actually good venture investors who are experienced is actually not that many. So many times entrepreneurs have gotten disillusioned after meeting a few investors, and they feel there'll be a larger pool of more experienced investors who understand how working with companies in the Valley. So that's also justified. Sometimes it is not very justified. They'll look at some article about some company in the Valley will raise $50 million at some crazy valuation. They go to a local investor who gives them a fraction of that, and they'll think, what, these guys don't get it. I need to go to somebody who will pay me 10 times more valuation. So that's just perception in some cases. So yeah.
There are some softer issues also that show up, where some of the entrepreneurs do appreciate the fact that the scars that Nakul was referring to translate into meaningful advantage if you have somebody like that on their side. So if, for example, we take a look at the experience that, and this is talking about investor maturity. We always talk about the entrepreneurs have to get more mature, so do the investors. We are all growing up together, so to speak. And that does come through once in a while, that you meet an investor here. And so it is very hard, however, to convince an investor here to say that leave your day job if you're not already focused on India and suddenly let's go invest in India. So historically, we, for example, had a US venture capital firm that was an investor in our firm. And one of the reasons that was started was because they hoped that there would be companies in India where they could start deploying capital. The reality turns out to be that they have enough to do morning, day and night, that the occasion that you reach out to them and say, hey, here is an interesting thing, by the time it reaches up in their stack, time is kind of run out. So it comes back to the separation of teams that both Dinesh and Nakul were talking about also.
Very good. I have just a couple of quick questions, and then if we go through this quick, we might be able to get one or two questions from there before we're done. One, the other side of investment, there's a lot of money and people are investing, but ROI, return. Any particular trends you're seeing in India, M&A, IPO, where are people going?
Go for it. You're the only one who's seen a big answer.
I think that's the question that makes all of us a lot more religious than we otherwise might be. No, so yeah, I think we are still in the early days. There is still a lot of hesitation globally, for companies to really take large bets on that market. I think we're seeing very high interest levels, but that translating into cross-border transactions. Early days, I think obviously things like the Walmart Flipkart transaction help a lot, but also the world will be watching very carefully, in terms of how that sort of pans out. And I think sort of domestically we do, there is some early efforts, but how do we start creating a different kind of support infrastructure for the public markets where these sort of newer age companies are able to go public, right? And again, I think enough investors are seeing that as an opportunity. We're seeing some early promising signs, but early days for sure.
Okay, wonderful. Now, with the ambassador here, and maybe I'll ask the question that was asked earlier. One, you guys all have experience of cross-border investments and transactions, and any lessons learned in terms of what we could do to change or make things better from a policy or from just the role of the government or corporations? Anything come to mind that we want to share? Should we just go? Yeah, please.
So, so we do a lot of cross-border investments. On the US side, a common problem happens. A lot of these cases, the cross-border companies, the founder or the CEO, they need to move from India to the US. Is it different than big IT services companies moving thousands of people here? This is about one or two people moving. And usually this company is successful, they'll be hiring a lot of people here because that CEO will not sit alone. But that's often a challenge, happening, and that's where we've seen a lot of challenges in the last few years. So making that simpler, In the case of India, I've over the last couple of years incorporated entities where I was part of them, or we've got an American who's based in India, and it's just very challenging. You've simple things around doing business. I think you mentioned about how it's moving up, but still, I would say there's a significant gap. The system is designed for resident Indians sitting in India, and still it's onerous for them. If you're not physically there, they've got 500 documents. These should be notarized, apostilled, stamped from here to A to B, B to C. I think it's sometimes I think that could be simpler. And sometimes maybe the policy is there, but the underlying implementation or the people who are on the ground, they don't know it. So everybody has 10 different versions of what needs to be done, which makes it challenging. So those are some of the problems we run into.
So without, this is really down in the weeds. A lot of our company law is designed across treating all companies kind of equally, whereas there is a lot to be learned about. Smaller companies need to be treated slightly differently than larger companies, and as you transition, of course, the demands on them have to change. And we can spend more time about the specifics of that, but this uniform company law applied to small and large companies alike is one of the places where it begins to show up. Classes of shares, preferential rights, a whole bunch of stuff that here has been implemented to help move startup companies along would also help.
How does it work here? Is there selective discrimination?
So it is more of a private company stock is treated differently than, so you can have different classes of shares and things like that. So it has been built so that it's not really different laws per se, but different parts of them become applicable.
I'll take it a little more macro, and I'll say I think India needs to become the most immigrant-friendly country in the world. That's like ultimately, like PM Modi launched Make in India campaign. I think he should launch a Study in India campaign. Become the most immigrant-friendly. I mean, college education in India is excellent, actually. And if we can attract the world's best talent that starts there at the age of 18, and then some of that will stay there, over time, they'll all collectively create the ecosystem to really thrive in every way and push for the changes in other aspects like legal aspects or innovation. I think that culture is still missing about truly embracing a global world.
I think that point, I was going to make a related point about how do we actually attract people from other parts of the world to view India as an interesting place to come and work. And I think that's one of the pieces that helps with this sort of view of India as being a bit of a black box, right, and a bit of an unknown sort of territory. I think the other thing, if you can really pull some strings and reduce the time difference between India and the US, that
You know what? Just a few closing quick remarks is when you think about the Companies Act that was reformed, and then insolvency and bankruptcy laws, GST, and a whole bunch of ease of doing business, India is really on a rise. But what I find in my travels when I talk to companies, they still have a view of India that's 10 years old. And unless you go there today and you travel and you see the excitement and the joy and the innovation that's going on, it really is very exciting to be in India. Okay, thank you. Please give a round of applause to the panel. To be in India.